This
members
meeting
of the
is being
Ethereum
recorded.
space. Oh, that was pretty loud. Okay, in the Ethereum space that are contributing silently in Singapore and around the region. And so I thought it'd be great to try and pull together some really, how do I put it? Operator centric. Is there a good way of calling it? Like people who are deep in the space that are working at the protocols themselves or doing research or growing ecosystems, right? And so that's why we put together a series of that's pretty broad. So four different speakers in about 3 weeks. So today we have Cliff. He works in Arbitrum. Before that it was UIDX, but by both roles, his role was focused on governance. And I thought this would be pretty relevant over this block. I remember speaking to about 3 or 4 folks that were thinking about governance and Web3 and especially like how to participate in DAOs or how DAOs function. Arbitrum is very unique. I think they have been fairly successful in their journey towards decentralization and running the DAO in their own unique way. They tend to get juxtaposed to optimism, but I think you can definitely see a completely different flavor of governance that Arbitrum has managed to pull off over the last, I think, about year as the DAO eventually, or as the DAO is slowly taking shape. For the next 3 speakers, just to give you a quick introduction briefly before I get Cliff to join. So Lisa will be talking about crypto economics. She's from Singapore and she wrote the book Economics Design. You'll see her in Denver if you are going. She speaks there almost every year. I'm actually at her house now having dinner, but so I think she's super excited to be on board also, and is hoping to also connect with different fellows that have some experience with data science. And she's hoping to see what are some interesting ideas that might come up from the conversation. 28th Feb, we have Lip EVM. So not sure if you have met him before. He's semi-anon and does a lot of work on the MEV space. You can search, or you can go to lipmev.com to take a look at the dashboard that he has created. And it's pretty impressive actually when you look at it. You can actually search up all the individual searches, their profit margins, the share of transactions, all that done by him. Yeah. And for our last conversation on 6th March, this one took a bit of finessing, but I'm glad that it's coming together. In Asia, one of the most prominent communities is this community called the ARC community, right? And it started in Singapore. And ARC started out by bringing in pretty prominent Web3 leaders and also young Web2 like entrepreneurs, right? So including pretty famous pop artists. I don't know how to describe it, but in Singapore, we do have like a pretty famous Mendo pop artist that is one of the co-founders of ARC. And it's been about almost 2 years already. And ARC has been slowly gathering the movers and shakers in the space. And I thought, Kernel with the expo and all the different journeys that everybody has, actually, they are big fans of Kernel. And this is a great time to connect both sides. And ARC will be bringing in some of the members who have experience working on venture building, right? So Josh, he's a venture builder, a venture architect from an incubator / accelerator called Manyala, which is backed by the Sovereign Wealth Fund of Singapore. And so they have been working on trying to grow some Web3 startups. Elroy is the CEO of ARC and co-founder. And CY leads the ecosystem venture building work at Polygon, right? So that's why we wanted to pull a session about venture building in communities, which is kind of the thesis of ARC, right? So without further ado, can I invite Cliff to join and give a quick introduction about himself? And I'm hoping this, session would be as interactive as possible. Feel free to ask, questions. I'll try and moderate where we can. And I think hope that the conversation will be interesting for everybody. So, Cliff.
All right, thanks, QZ. Very nice to meet everyone and the Kernel community. It's my first time meeting anyone from Kernel, in fact. So QZ and I have actually met quite a few times in real life, and he was telling me about this initiative, and I was like, I definitely need to be a part of it. So yeah, very, very privileged to be able to share a little bit more about Web3 governance today. So just a primer, Web3 governance isn't the most sexy topic when people think about crypto, but it is one of the core pillars behind why, people are actually working in crypto. So all the idealists out there beyond the price action, they are actually looking at how decentralized communities can actually collaborate together, how people from all around the world can actually trustlessly contribute to a common collective. And this is what governance is all about. So I've had experience working in governance over at DYDX, where I was previously from, and then currently working at the Arbitrum Foundation, leading governance for the DAO as well. So I actually have a set of slides that I've prepared. So let me just go ahead and share my screen really quickly. Can you guys see my screen?
Yes, it's good.
Cool. All right. So I hope, again, this can be an interactive session. So along the way, if you guys have any questions, feel free to park them in the chat or, raise your hands and I can stop and answer your questions along the way. So let me just go into presentation mode real quick. So disclaimer, nothing in this session constitutes financial advice. Crypto is risky, so please do your own research. And the content and views that I've expressed in this session are my own personal opinions and are not representative of the Arbitrum Foundation, the DYDX Foundation, or the Arbitrum DAO, right? So standard disclaimer that I have to put out before we go into the content, right? So when we think about governance, it all brings about this topic of like, what are DAOs, right? So DAOs essentially is the acronym for decentralized autonomous organizations, and let's kind of break that down. So decentralized literally means that there's no one centralized party or no one centralized team that actually controls how everything runs, right? And again, this is the promise of crypto, right? Like, everyone is kind of like in control of their own assets, their own identity. And if you want to progress a collective together, a common mission together, you can do it in a decentralized fashion, right? So the D in DAO stands for decentralized. And again, it means that you're not under the control of any one individual entity or institution. So I actually use this icon right here because I don't necessarily think any one DAO has achieved full decentralization, right? There are still certain vectors of centralization. So it's always a journey towards progressive decentralization. So I like to think of it as a scale. So ultimately, as long as everyone in the DAO is working towards, progressively decentralizing, I think everyone's on the right path. But to my knowledge, today, right now, there is, well, outside of Ethereum, some might even argue Ethereum itself can be seen as centralized, but on the social layer front or whatever. But no one DAO to me has actually achieved full decentralization today. So let's go to the A. The A stands for autonomous, and that actually means that like they are capable of making their own decisions, right? They are not under the influence of any third party, of any government. So in a way, the DAO itself has a mission, right? They are self-governing, they're independent, they can choose whatever actions they want to take through governance, and they're subject to their own consensus-derived rules, right? So they're not under any nation state per se. They don't report up to any, president or government or whatnot, and they're ultimately self-governing. So the O lastly stands for organization. And it's pretty simple, right? It's just a collective of individuals who join together to achieve a common goal and to achieve some shared objectives. So was there a question?
No, all good.
Okay, cool. Okay, I'll continue. So DAOs, if you put them all together, right? How I like to think about it is DAOs are essentially a tool or an entity per se that allows us to work with like-minded individuals globally without having to trust a benevolent leader to manage operations, funds, or decisions, right? So everyone is, again, progressing this collective mission together. And right now, I'd say most DAOs actually have built-in treasuries, right? So tokens that no one has the authority to access without the approval of the collective, right? So this approval is actually where governance comes in. Governance is essentially decision-making and how decentralized parties actually coordinate together to move forward to make decisions, right? So smart contracts actually enable this to be possible in a way where the rules can actually be enforced in a transparent and trustless manner. So it's not like any one party can step in and say, hey, I don't like this at all. Even though everyone voted yes, I'm going to veto it and say no. So in most DAOs, if you achieve a majority vote, the intended actions, if it's coded that way, will actually be implemented and be executed autonomously, be enforced, and no one can kind of jump in to stop it. So this aspect of DAOs is what makes, I think, a lot of people actually want to try out this method of collective decision making and operations. So yeah, ultimately everything underpinning DAOs are smart contracts, and how do DAOs form, right? So a typical process is you usually have a software company, right, a labs team that actually builds and audits the core protocol. So for Arbitrum itself, we have off-chain labs that actually built the two main Arbitrum chains that are live today, Arbitrum One and Arbitrum Nova, right? And then more often than not, there is a token distribution event, an airdrop, right, on mainnet launch. And this is, again, not mandatory, but it is at the discretion of the team. I'm sure quite a few of you are actually beneficiaries of airdrops, but the whole point behind airdrops, more often than not, is to relinquish control of the core protocol to the community, right? Some might see this as like a legal thing where they don't want so much attention on like the main software company. Some might actually see this as like rewarding your core users, your loyal users. Think what you want about it, but ultimately airdrops are a very common way where DAOs are kind of launched. And as I mentioned, like once the airdrop is done, control of the core protocol is handed over to token holders, and the DAO, as a result, is formed as a collective of all these token holders who can collectively make decisions for the protocol, right? So beyond that, right, we actually do have quite a few special DAOs, right? So there aren't rules as to like how your DAO should form, right? So what I went through this earlier is more for like general purpose ecosystems, DeFi ecosystems, NFT and infrastructure projects. But we do have some social, I'd say social DAOs, right? So we have Constitution DAO, where a group of people actually came together and said that they want to buy the US Constitution. Unfortunately, they actually failed in the mission because they were outbidden by, I believe, Citadel's the founder of Citadel's son, something Griffin, which sparked some controversy. But ultimately, it was a good experiment to show that DAOs could work, right? And then we have Friends with Benefits DAO. This is essentially a DAO made up of creatives and builders that want to collect art together. Oh, sorry, I think that is Pleaser DAO. Sorry, I got confused. But Friends with Benefits is essentially just the social network where many entrepreneurs, builders, creatives actually come together and they want to build a better internet, right? So again, it's not like a financial incentive. It's not your typical crypto DAO. It's more of like, a social mission where they want to create a better internet. And then I mentioned Pleaser DAO. These are all the founders and all the more prominent people in Web3 that come together with a love for art and they want to collect art together collectively. We have things like Dave DAO, right? So some people might find this dumb. I find this quite interesting personally. And it's just a collective of people named Dave, right? So anyone with Dave in their name, whether you're David, Davidson, Dave itself, you can essentially be a part of this DAO and vibe alongside people with similar names, right? And then we also have some DAOs which are more focused on humanitarian missions. So for example, Ukraine DAO was formed to really lift the efforts behind the Russian invasion, to really act as an amplification channel to tell people how they can actually support the Russian and Ukraine war. Right, so it's not your everyday airdrop and then form a DAO. Some DAOs can form about just because there's an underlying social mission that everyone kind of aligns with. So these 5 are good examples of those. So some of the prominent DAOs out there, we have Uniswap, we have MakerDAO, we have Aave, we have Balancer, we have GMX, and then we have DYDX. So these are the more prominent DAOs in the DeFi space. And then on the layer 2 side of things, we have Arbitrum, we have Mantle, we have Optimism, and then on the LST side of things, there are DAOs too. So we have Lido, we have Rocketpool, and then lastly, on the NFT side of things, we have Treasure, we have Nouns, right? So whatever vertical in Web3 you're a part of, I'm pretty sure you can find a DAO out there that you can be a part of. So what is the typical governance process? Before I go on, let me check the chat real quick to see if there are any questions. 1 second. Oh, cool. QZ says ban DAO. So yeah, that's another interesting one. But yeah, typical governance process starts with forum discussions, right? So people will post their proposals on a public governance forum, and then that's where people can give feedback, give some back and forth, and then better the proposal, right? And then some of the common platforms that are used are Discourse and Commonwealth. Essentially, it's just a place for the community to come together, post their ideas and see whether everyone else kind of agrees with it, right? So moving on, most DAOs actually use an off-chain temperature check, right? And a platform like that would be Snapshot, right? So this is a way for the community to more or less understand what the general sentiment is, right? So say, for example, I as a community member wants to get $10 million from the treasury to launch like this program for the DAO, right? So I post it on the forums, and then after some feedback, I will actually put up an off-chain vote on a platform like Snapshot, just for token holders to start voting off-chain to signal to me whether they would be supportive of this proposal or not, right? So at this stage, nothing is on-chain just yet, so there is no implementation, whatnot. And only if there is strong consensus more often than not, then it goes on chain, right? So this is where like the trustless aspect of governance contracts come in. If the contract is actually put up on chain, people vote on it, it achieves quorum, it achieves like a majority of yes votes, then the core governance contracts would actually initiate the implementation of the executable code in the proposal, and no one can actually stop that, right? So we have platforms like Tally and Agora that actually are good governance UIs for on-chain proposals. So just one quick point to note is that everything at this stage would consist of your typical Web3 transaction. So you have to pay gas fees to vote. And then at this stage, it's more of an off-chain gasless stage. So this is where usually people would be more participative and actually vote as compared to going on chain. Let's move on. So what are some of the voting mechanisms out there, right?
Cliff, there's one question from Nandit, which is, can every Web3 project with a governance be labeled as a DAO?
I guess you can, right? So like a DAO is actually a term that's very loosely held. So as long as you can fulfill the 3 criteria of being decentralized, being autonomous, being able to make your own decisions, and there's a common collective, there's a common mission, then I guess you can call yourself a DAO. Yeah. So if today, I want to run this NFT platform, and then I get QZ, I get Sid, I get like 20 of you to join like my common mission, and we have tokens, we can call it a DAO as well, because there is no one party that essentially can make decisions on behalf of everyone. I mean, it depends on how you want to allocate the tokens, right? So the whole point is that as long as you fulfill the decentralization aspect, as long as you can, autonomously make decisions as a collective, and as long as you have a common vision that you're working towards, you can essentially call yourself a DAO. No one's gonna be like, hey, you're not a DAO, hey, you're not a DAO. Yeah, it's whatever you want it to be, man. Cool, I don't see any more questions, so let me move on. Cool, so what are some of the voting mechanisms, right? So I think before I go into the visuals that I have here, voting in Web3 and governance in Web3 is very similar to how voting works in traditional companies, right? So, I'm sure a lot of you guys know how like stocks work, right? Maybe some of you even own stocks, right? So as a stockholder, right, you are essentially an owner of the company that you own a stock of, right? So say, for example, for Microsoft, you own Microsoft shares. Technically, you are like a minority owner for Microsoft, and you can actually vote on some of their initiatives. You can vote to remove their board of directors. You can vote to make sure that their CEO, CFO, or whatever is more transparent. So as a shareholder, you actually have quite a bit of power, but not everyone actually exercises that power of a shareholder, right? So in crypto land, in DAOs, it's the same, right? If you hold, like, say, for example, one maker token, or you hold one uni token, essentially you can actually vote on whatever happens in the DAO. You have decision-making power even though it might not be a lot, right? So this is what we call one token, one vote. If you hold one token, then you're entitled to one vote. It's a very simple, I'd say, democratic format. So the more capital you put in, the more voting power you have, right? So there are quite a few benefits to this, and then there are quite a few disadvantages to this one token, one vote model, right? So people would say that it's democratic, right? Because the amount of capital you put in would be the amount of power that you have, right? And then it actually brings about, questions around whether DAOs should be run that way, right? Because this is actually linked to plutocracy, right? So what if, one guy just comes in with an enormous amount of money and takes over the entire DAO, right? Then would that actually be, what the DAO is actually working towards? So is democracy actually the best way forward? So there are arguments against this one token, one vote model. And then we also have delegation, which is possible, right? So delegation essentially means that you as a token holder, you entrust your token's voting power to another individual who is more active in the DAO, who knows the day-to-day happenings, who knows what the best decision to make for the DAO is, right? So again, I'm going to use everyone here as an example, and most crypto investors, in fact, right? Like you guys all own a bunch of tokens. And to generalize, right? I think a lot of us actually own tokens for the purposes of speculation, for the purposes of capital appreciation, for the purposes of yield, right? How many of us actually, goes deep into the root, into the weeds, and understands exactly what's happening on a day-to-day basis on the operational front? Like, how do we know what Uniswap is intending to do, right? Whether they are looking to upgrade to V4, or how do we know what Arbitrum is trying to do, whether it is trying to launch a new chain? I bet like 95% of token holders don't actually know, but there is that select few, the 5% in my example, that are very involved in the day-to-day, right? Like they are in the forums every day, they vote on every single proposal. So all these individuals are actually in a much better position, in a much more competent position to make decisions on behalf of the token holders, right? So there is this concept called delegation, where you can essentially trust your voting power of your tokens to another individual, but you as the token holder, you keep ownership of the tokens, right? So delegation is actually very, very common across many one token, one vote DAOs. And delegation in itself also has its pros and cons. I can get into that later. But yeah, delegation is something that I personally am a big fan of. I've written quite a few pieces on it. I speak with a lot of people on it. So if anyone here is keen on vibing and talking to me about delegation, feel free to hit my DMs. Yeah. So just to go back to like the disadvantages of one token, one vote. Outside of plutocracy, there is also voter apathy, and this is what I was talking to you guys earlier about, right? Like 95% of token holders don't actually know what's going on, right? So there is a lot of information asymmetry, and when it comes to like a mandatory vote, by the way, no votes are mandatory, but in the event that there is, right, how can we trust that the 95% of people would actually vote to the best benefit of the DAO, right? So this is what voter apathy is all about. Like people just don't care about proposals, people just don't vote. It's the same with politics today, right? Like I think in Singapore it's quite different, but you look at the US, right? Like we have quite a few, a high majority of people who don't actually vote, and that is why you can see all the politicians telling people, "Go vote, your vote matters," right? And your vote does matter, but people just don't care because there aren't any financial incentives or whatnot. And then lastly, people might argue that one token, one vote is actually inefficient because you need to make sure that like you get a good majority to actually vote. And it's just difficult to reach people. It's difficult to incentivize them to actually vote. And ultimately, for decisions that need to be made in a timely fashion, in a fast manner, I'm not sure whether one token, one vote actually would allow that to happen, right? So that is a quick TLDR of one token, one vote, its benefits and its cons, right? And then for some, the DAOs that employ this one token, one vote would be like Uniswap, like Aave, like Balancer, and Nouns. So for Nouns, it's one noun, one vote. So for some of the DAOs, we have council models, and these council models are essentially where a group of individuals are actually elected to make decisions on behalf of the DAO, right? So they are actually more informed individuals that people actually say, okay, I want him to make decisions on my behalf, and I'm voting for him to be my representative. So essentially, this council is a representation of everyone in the DAO, and they don't actually have to discuss their decision making, their thought frameworks behind what they think about certain proposals with the DAO, right? They can just make decisions between themselves. So what this brings about from an advantageous point of view is that you get quality and efficient decision making, but at the same time there is a risk of centralization, right? So what if, like, say for example, there's 10 people on the council, 11 people on the council actually decide to go rogue and steal all the funds from every single token holder? There is always that risk, even though it might be small. So it's always this trade-off that DAOs have to kind of contend with, right? So we have DAOs like synthetics, like Element Finance that run council models, and then we have hybrid models as well, right? So over on the Arbitrum side, we have a one token, one vote model, as well as a security council. So the security council essentially can step in to veto any malicious proposals, and they can step in to deploy any emergency fixes as and when needed, right? So they have a very specific mandate and they cannot act outside of their mandate. So that is what we have over at the Arbitrum side of things, the Arbitrum DAO. For Optimism, they also have two sides, right? They have the one token, one side, one vote, and then they have a citizens house, right? So this citizen house comprises of people who are very involved in the DAO that can actually make decisions when it comes to retroactive public goods funding, right? So retroactive RGPF is essentially something that is very big in the whole Optimism ecosystem. And they are essentially entrusting all the RGPF decisions to a group of citizens, right? So it's kind of like a council model working alongside the one token, one vote model. And then one interesting governance dynamic that we see in Lido is we have the LDO token holders on one side, and then we have the STE holders on the other side, right? So there is this dynamic because Lido is, for all of you that don't know, Lido is the majority LST out there, liquid staking platform out there today. I believe they control like 34% of all staked ETH, which is a big concern for a lot of folks in Ethereum land, right? So can LDO holders actually, vote on behalf of all these like 34% of ETH stake, right? That is a big risk. And that is why like there is discussions of having STETH holders. So people who literally stake their ETH with Lido and get STETH in return to have governance rights, to have, ways to enforce certain accountability measures on LDO token holders. So yeah, it's an interesting experiment that would be good to kind of flash out. So yeah, don't have any answers for you guys as to like which model is the best. Everyone is still in experimentation mode. I see that Sid, you turned your camera off, so I assume that there's a question.
We have a couple of questions in the chat from Helen and Marlene.
Okay. So I see Helen's question: how can older projects that launched before DAOs became popular introduce their own DAO, considering most DAOs today are created during token launch with immediate governance and delegation? Well, when you say older projects, I assume they are still centralized, so they can always choose to do a token drop. Again, not financial advice, but yeah, that is how you can essentially know who you want to relinquish control to, right? There are many ways to launch DAOs, right? It might not be via tokens, it can be via other mechanisms like NFTs, right? So say, for example, you can actually airdrop a Soulbound token to all of your most loyal project users, right? And then they can come aboard and start to make decisions collectively on behalf of the DAO. So yeah, many different ways. And I'd say like anyone can any project can get started and create their own DAO if they want to. So to answer Marlene's question, what do you think about other governance mechanisms like quadratic voting, Futaki? I personally don't have a favorite right now. And I think like every model has their own advantages and disadvantages, right? So quadratic voting is very popular because it kind of normalizes the votes by big token holders, and it allows for more representation from smaller token holders. But at the same time, people actually question, is that actually the most efficient way? Is that actually the most democratic way? Because if I put in a certain amount of capital as compared to a significantly more capital than you as fellow token holders, I should actually get relative the proportionately the same amount of voting power as compared to you, right? So there are always criticisms over every single governance model, and I don't personally think any one DAO has kind of nailed governance. And again, right, like governance from DAO to DAO differs, right? So for example, where I used to work at DYDX, right, governance was very much about how do we actually make sure that certain parameters are optimized so that trading is flawless and that we don't get wrecked by funding rates and whatnot, right? And if I compare it to like Arbitrum, where I work today, it's a lot more like base layer. It's a lot more vertical. There are many more different verticals to consider when it comes to governance. Like how do you balance the benefits and the rights of like projects in the DeFi space versus projects in the NFT space? How do you actually craft proposals together that is more inclusive and encompassing? So in that sense, maybe one token, one vote might be the best way to go. But in a DYDX world, maybe a council where decisions have to be made quickly and by very people with like very high levels of expertise on like how trading works. Ultimately, again, every DAO has their own like needs, and there is no like one blanket approach when it comes to governance for all DAOs. So hopefully I answer your question. Shri Raj has a question saying, how do folks join or become a contributor to the DAO given they had their token delegation done or already functioning team? Hold on, let me read this question again. Okay, so I actually have a slide prepared for this question, so I'll answer it later. Nandit has another question. What kind of decisions on chains go better via one token, one vote versus council versus hybrid? So as I mentioned, right, it depends on the DAO's needs. If a DAO needs to move very quickly, then you shouldn't go via one token, one vote, right? You should maybe consider electing a council because that's where like you can make decisions within say like 4 to 24 hours, right? And for some governance decisions, they have like very heavy stakes. So people would actually question whether you want to entrust everything to like a select group of people. So it depends again on what kind of DAO and what mission they're trying to accomplish. Yeah, and then for Fave Truffle, how can DAOs eliminate the risk of delegations supporting each other's friends, helping friends situation, even if some of the proposals don't have any tangible, meaningful value other than benefiting the proposing project? Good question. This is where we need to make sure that there are some checks and balances in place, right? So whether it's the foundation, whether it's other delegates, they can or they need to actually address such problems and they need to be public about it, right? And I think this is very common across DAOs, right? We don't really have people afraid to offend other people because maybe we all work async. I don't need to see your face. I can just work anonymously. So I think people are more generally okay and not afraid to speak up. And it boils down to like how are tokens being allocated? How is voting power being allocated? I'd say like delegates supporting each other is definitely like a possibility. Then token holders might have to evaluate whether they are delegating to the correct delegates or not. So there are quite a few like ways to counter this inbreeding, this nepotism, this situation where like you help me, I help you. But there isn't like one clear cut answer. And I believe there are ways on chain to kind of enforce these checks and balances as well, right? So we have things like you need to have at least a certain quorum for certain decisions to pass, right? Say for example, you need to have at least 51% of all token holders that says of all voting power that vote yes before it can go through. So yeah, there are many different ways to counteract all of these potential issues. And lastly, Tin had a question. How do you decide which voting mechanism is best for a DAO? Are there particular situations where one governance model is favorable over the other? It depends on what kind of decisions your DAO is looking to make, right? Like going back to like my example along DYDX and Arbitrum. DYDX is this, you know, decentralized exchange that is operating at a lightning neck speed, right? So when it comes to like new market listings, or when it comes to like, you know, liquidations, right? How does, you know, the DAO actually make decisions in a timely fashion so that, you know, the protocol is actually protected and isn't, you know, drained or isn't exploited, right? So this is where like maybe, you know, you can consider having counsel in place, because, you know, they are the people that can actually monitor all of these vulnerabilities and act in a quick manner, in an efficient manner. But when it comes to like maybe base layer tokens or base layers like Arbitrum, like Optimism, you know, maybe it makes more sense to have a one token, one vote where, you know, everyone can kind of chime in, and then you can actually delegate, and delegates can actually make sure that they represent their token holders in a diversified manner to make the best decisions on behalf of the DAO. So ultimately, it depends on the nature of the DAO, and depends on what situations and what decisions they have to make in what timely fashion it is. So yeah, those were all the questions thus far. Let me move on really quickly. Let me do a quick time check. So it's 8:40. Yeah, so quickly on delegates, right? Like I grabbed a couple of screenshots of like how delegates, or rather how delegation in Arbitrum kind of works, right? So in most DAOs, you can actually find a similar dashboard where you have all these like delegates that are requesting for people to actually vote on them. So they have like delegate profiles, you know, say for example, like L2B, which is very famous in the crypto space, right? They are a prominent delegate in the Arbitrum ecosystem, right? So they actually have like a delegate statement saying why they should get your vote, or why they should delegate to you, right? And then you can actually see like how many people have actually delegated to them, and you can actually also track like how active they have been when it comes to voting and commenting on proposals, right? And then what I like about, you know, some of the delegates in Arbitrum land is that they actually take the time to post their rationale on why they will vote for or against certain proposals, right? So say for example, Max from Connect, right, the bridge, prominent Arbitrum delegate as well. So he also always posts on the forum saying why he votes against or for a certain proposal, and he posts his reasoning. Same for Karel, who is the co-founder of Treasure. He also makes sure that he takes the time to, you know, post quality feedback on how his team actually feels about a certain proposal, whether they will vote yes or no, and what the reasons are behind their decisions, right? So I think these are very important when it comes to transparency, when it comes to accountability to your delegators. And this is the kind of behavior that I'd love to see in other DAOs as well, because this is what would drive decentralization, would drive decision making in a decentralized level. Yeah. So, you know, challenges and opportunities with governance today. I've touched on quite a couple of these during the governance model slides, but there is things like legitimacy, right? Like, you know, if I, as MakerDAO, right, like say for example, I make decisions and I say, okay, cool, I want to diversify all of the value locked, right, in the CDPs into like real world assets. Would the banks that actually hold these real world assets actually entertain MakerDAO? Even though MakerDAO can come up with, say, for example, 100 million. So there is always this question of legitimacy. How do DAOs actually interact with the real world? Does the real world actually recognize the decisions and the governance efforts by the DAO, right? So this is the constant fight that we're trying to get to win as a crypto ecosystem. And you know, I think most of the fights right now are on the legal and regulatory front. So you can see like the SEC and all the regulatory bodies are in the US specifically are clamping down on crypto projects and deeming them as, you know, being illegitimate, right? Maybe they have their own incentives, right? But you know, ultimately, this is something that we face in almost all jurisdictions, Singapore included. And I think this is all because there is a lack of education, there's a lack of evangelism of Web3, and there is a lack of people coming into Web3 to talk about it, right? We need more talent in the space to increase our legitimacy. Governance processes are also, you know, phases of challenges as well as opportunities. So like, you know, I was talking about one token, one vote. It is a form of direct democracy, but that would mean that there is plutocracy, and then that would also mean that there's a high chance of voter apathy. There is also the possibility of misalignment of incentives, and then there are coordination inefficiencies and difficult organizational structures that people might have to deal with, that have to navigate if they want to make their voices heard, right? So no one DAO, again, has, to me, nailed their governance process. Everyone is still experimenting on what would work, and there's no one blanket approach, right? Each DAO has their own needs, has their own decision making, has their own speed of execution that they need to execute on. So that would actually inform of what governance process would suit them best. And then we have security, right? Because underpinning DAOs are smart contracts, similar to like, and that includes like governance contracts, right? So there is always the risk of like the governance contracts being exploited. And then lastly, it's community engagement, right? Like, how do we actually build sustainable cultures in DAOs? How do we make sure that people are always engaged and incentivized to continue participating? Because we can always throw around all these big words like decentralization, like autonomy, but if there aren't ways to sustainably make sure that people participate in a continuous basis, people will get burned out, delegates will get burned out, contributors will get burned out, and then they'll leave, and then that DAO will eventually just die off, right? So I think finding a consistent way of engaging the community is very important, and it's something that I really haven't seen any DAO really nail down on. Right, so even though that was a lot of negativity, I do have quite a few sentences I'd like to share, right? So like, we were in the thick of the bear market from 2022 to 2023, but I believe DAOs have actually persistently forged ahead. They have improved substantially from tooling, from governance tooling, from governance processes in their design, functionality, and adoption. And this resurgence is actually not a technical evolution, but a shift in mindset, right, towards decentralized governance. We are actually seeing many different collectives of people, whether it's individuals, whether it's small teams, whether it's large companies, actually be participating in governance, right? Because they acknowledge what the advantages are of inclusive decision-making processes, right? So I'm going to use an example in Arbitrum land, right? Like we have big companies like let me think of one that is non-Web3, like Consensus is Web3, like Google, right? Like Microsoft, like Reddit, that used to be, that are actually, they have teams that actually, make sure that they are up to speed on what Web3 is like, and they selectively participate in certain DAOs just to, make sure that, their teams know what's going on, and at the same time, find opportunities for them to penetrate the DAO and gain some advantages from there, right? So we are actually seeing like many different traditional organizations actually come into Web3 and participating in decentralized governance, and ultimately, this heightened interest has sparked the exploration across diverse industries. We have public sectors, we have private sectors considering how DAOs can be integrated into their organizational and decision-making structures. So to a question that I failed to answer earlier, because I said that I have slides prepared for them, you don't need tokens to be a part of DAO, right? You can actually be a delegate, right? So most delegates actually in Arbitrum land don't actually own tokens, right? But they actually have people delegating their tokens, voting power to them. So it's not a financial requirement for you to be a part of a DAO. You can be a part of a working group as well. You can get grants, right? So you can say, for example, hack and fix some bounties, or maybe launch some media campaigns for the DAO and get paid. That is how you can get grants and be a part of DAO as well. You can be an individual contributor. You can do pull requests and then suggest any improvements to the code stack. You can actually go onto the forums, create a profile, and then start participating in discussions without having tokens in itself. Or you can actually help with community management, right? Like most DAOs are global, so there is always a need for like localized support, right? So you can actually be a community manager, put up your hand, say, hey, for example, I am fluent in Korean, so I can actually help manage the Korean community. So I think this is a big need, especially in Asia, because English isn't the first language for a lot of countries in Asia. So community management is actually like a key I'd say like a good area for you to explore if you want to be a part of DAO, right? And you can get paid. You can even land a full-time gig by participating and contributing to DAOs. Actually, that was how I got into like DYDX in the first place. Like I was doing a little bit of trading and I was giving feedback. And you know, I talked to the team and they were like, okay, come on board, right? So it's not like I submitted my resume in. And I think this is how most people in Web3 actually get jobs and get gigs, right? Like it's all about your contributions. It's all about your participation instead of the traditional, you know, you look at a job profile, you put in your resume, you put in a cover letter, you speak to interviewers. That can work as well, but looking at participation is actually a very powerful way to get into a certain gig. Right. So you can, you know, again, tackle bounty boards, you can put up proposals, you can, you know, to my point earlier, manage communities, you can apply for grants, you can be a program project manager, you can do consulting advisory services, whatever it is, right? Like DAOs are always in need of talent. So whatever expertise you have, you know, find a way to help the DAO, and, you know, I'm sure the DAO will notice you and, you know, pay you for it or even give you a full-time gig for it. So yeah, this is the end of my presentation. Let me just look through the chat really quickly and see whether there are any other questions. Cool. So from Daria Kao, how do you handle civil attacks on the current DAO mechanism? Would you consider a better solution like one passport, one vote mechanism for strong civil resistance? Potentially, right? Like we have this Gitcoin passport thing that's going on, and then we have attestation stations by Ethereum. So there are many DAOs that are considering how to incorporate civil mechanisms. But if you look at, you know, one token, one vote models, right? Like it is capital requirement. So more often than not, you need to, you know, have a sizable chunk of, you know, capital injection for you to civil attack, right? And that itself is a civil like deterrent as well. So let me see if there are any kind of questions. I read Toyota is going into DAOs. Maybe. I haven't really read that. And then Sriraj mentioned, we actually got a grant from the Arbitrum Foundation. Are we eligible to participate in DAO activities? Even if you didn't get a grant, you are eligible. And I'm happy to kind of like, you know, take you through how you can start. And then Parth had the last question. Can you show some light on how to incentivize folks to be a part of the DAO and actively contribute? Well, there are many ways to incentivize people to contribute, right? Like, you know, the first and the very realistic one is, you know, you own tokens, right? You want your bags to pump, right? How do you actually get your bags to pump? You know, the DAO has to be progressive. The DAO has to move at a good speed. The DAO has to have good innovations, right? And then that generates hype, that generates more media coverage. And then that's where like people will want to buy the token and then your bags pump. That is the most obvious like incentive to be a part of the DAO. There are social incentives as well, right? Like, you know, finding like-minded people to collaborate with. You know, I think it's severely understated how important, or rather how empowering it is to work with like-minded people. And yeah, you just find yourself like making new friends that you never would have been introduced to if you never worked for a DAO. So yeah, many different ways for you to be incentivized. Sid has the last question. How has the perception of DAOs been changing for people in Asia in recent years? So in Asia, unfortunately, I think we still have a very capitalistic mindset where we are just focused on like token price appreciation, right? And views. So we need more people like QZ and like Sid, who run Kernel, to really evangelize like, you know, what the ideals of, you know, being crypto are. The ideals of, you know, working in DAOs are, and how it actually changes and how it actually challenges the status quo of working in traditional organizations. So we definitely need more talents in, we need more evangelism. In Asia, we need more localized languages, localized content, right? So to my point around community management, because English isn't a native language for many. And then second question, how have different emerging primitives in crypto and AI been impacting governance? So I know of some DAOs that are experimenting with AI governance, but I think most don't really have like a good enough data set to train their models to make the right decisions, right? And I think, again, it depends from DAO to DAO, right? Some DAOs would need to make decisions at a breakneck speed. So that's where like AI might be useful, but it is a centralizing actor, right? it is one AI? What if it decides to go rogue? What if someone hacks the AI? So there is a risk there. Any resources you recommend to go through before designing a DAO for any protocol? There are a ton out there. Maybe I can send them to QZ and then we can share it in the Telegram group channel. Faith Truffle said, I have a question to ask that will take forever to write. Can you jump in? Sid, is that okay?
Hey Cliff. So firstly, did you see the article by Token Bryce about how Aave governance is a circus, is a show?
I mean, I did read that, and many other DAOs have been criticized as circuses as well. But yeah.
Yeah, because I also experienced some similar situations. For example, our proposal was killed in Optimism DAO. Our proposal was killed in Mental DAO, even if there was a lot of community support. And I had the chance to meet with the head of ecosystem at Mental Layer 2. And he basically said that, our Chinese core team is invested in a rival of yours. So we can't do anything, even if the community supports it a lot. Like, what is your? I fortunately didn't have a bad experience with Arbitrum DAO yet. So, what is your take in it? Like, there's a foundation, there's a governance, and the foundation is doing investments. They have friends, they have this and that. And then the governance is kind of blocked.
I don't have a direct answer for you, right? But what I can say about at least for Arbitrum, is that the foundation is very abstracted away from the DAO day-to-day operations and governance activities. We don't have a say in how things run. So say, for example, a service provider for Optimism, for Mantle, for ZK Sync or whatever, wants to provide its services to Arbitrum. It's not like we will come in and say, hey, just because you do things for our competitors, we don't want you here because, we're tribalistic that way. At least for Arbitrum, we're not like that. I wouldn't say that's the case for all DAOs. It seems like you experienced that firsthand for Mantle. But I'd say shoot your shot, right? I don't think there's any downsides outside of time invested in participating in the governance process. And I'm pretty sure when it comes to the Arbitrum DAO, we would be a lot more inclusive. Chilling my DAO here, but yeah.
That was all.
Cool.
Thank you.
Wonderful. Any other questions or comments?
I don't see any.
Yeah, I have one last question which I can ask, which is have you seen any patterns between more regenerative, mission-focused DAOs versus the different kinds of DAOs that you mentioned? Have there been any clear governance patterns that separate these DAOs from each other, and which work better for a regen DAO versus a more investment-focused DAO versus other applications?
Yeah, so I guess it really depends on what the DAO's mission is, right? So for regen DAO or for Celo, for example, which is big on regen everything, right? I'm sure their governance processes are tailored to make sure that regenerative mechanisms are the priority as compared to, again, say for example, a DYDX or a GMX, right? Where it's a DEX where it needs to move at breakneck speed to make sure that trading is flawless, right? So different DAOs would need different governance models. There's no one blanket approach. And I wouldn't say that there is a converging pattern or whatnot. But what I would say about patterns is that there are more and more institutions and companies that are involved in governance, right? I covered this earlier because they are finding advantages to that, right? Whether it's talent, whether it's ideas, whether it's capital, there's definitely a ton of benefits to being participative in DAO governance, and we are seeing the big boys come into play, and we welcome them, right? So we just need to manage their expectations.
Thanks, Cliff. I'll ask QZ if he has any final words.
No, but I think this session went amazingly. Thank you everyone for I don't know, I don't think you were grilling Cliff, but I think I think it was a very fruitful discussion about like the realities of working in a DAO. So thank you so much for doing this, Cliff.
All good. Yeah, feel free to grill me, man. I love being challenged. And I would say that I'm not like a governance expert, whatnot. I definitely have like other peers which are like governance nerds. So if you have any questions that I can't answer, I can direct you to other people.
Sure.
We should
So
probably
Cliff,
do a kernel session with like
Hmm.
governance leads across the DAOs. Like, I think we could
Yeah.
easily get Jonas maybe from Optimism, right? We could probably get whoever the new governance lead is going to be at Starknet, maybe even your old folks at DYDX. I think like a discussion like this would be insane, man.
Yeah, for sure. Like I know most of them. Like Jonas is on the RGPF front. The guy that you
Yeah,
want to
yeah.
reach out to at Optimism is Justine. And then like ZK Singh has their own like governance lead as well. And then we have MakerDAO. I know someone there. So yeah, if there's interest, let me know. I can help pull together some names.
Mm. Yeah, that would be amazing, man. Okay, yes, that's all I have to
Cool.
say. Thank you so much, Cliff. Yeah.
Awesome, appreciate it. So yeah, if there's anyone else that needs me to answer any questions, feel free to pop them in, I think Slack or Telegram, or find a way to
Yeah.
reach me via QZ. And yeah, very happy to be sharing here today. Thanks for the
Sure.
invite.
So thank you, Cliff. For everyone in kernel, like I'll be adding Cliff to the Slack channels in kernel so that we can have more such collaborative discussions in the future and hopefully organize the like cross DAO session that QZ just mentioned. So thank you, everyone. Like if you want to hang out, you can hang out in the kernel gather space after this, but we'll have a office hour session in a couple of hours from now, which you have an invite to. So feel free to discuss then as well. Okay.
All right.
That's
Thanks,
all.
Thank you,
guys. Have a
everyone.
good one. Bye.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you, Jahan, Isa, Vivek.
Thank you for organizing this.
Yeah, our pleasure. And we have more sessions tomorrow. So that will be an exciting one.
Thank you.
Sure. Good morning, Vivek. Pretty early for you, right?
Yes. A little too early to make the whole session, but how did it go, Sid? Maybe if you want to stop the recording, we could. But it sounds like Cliff enjoyed.